All right, so good morning, everyone. Last day. First, want to say this conference it's my first conference coming to VulnCon. I am Sandy Radesky. I'm the Associate Director for Vulnerability Management at CISA. And I've brought a diverse panel of folks here today. Purposefully, CISA has been really leading the charge on being more transparent, being very collaborative with industry. And so instead of coming here with just a panel of, a bunch of govies, we wanted to give you guys a diverse perspective of what we're actually doing on the CISA side and how we work with industry and kind of capture those opinions. If you don't know, I'm just going to really quickly introduce the panel. Chris Hughes here, he is the president of Aquia and also a Cyber Innovation Fellow. He does a lot of communication on social media about the products and analysis that we put out at CISA, and it's really a good mechanism to keep everyone informed in our community. And he does a lot of podcasts that help to get, kind of set the record straight on all the different things that are happening in the government space. So really just appreciate Chris being here and taking the time to travel to be on this panel. So thank you so much. And I've got Bob Lord here. Bob is the Lord of Secure by Design, and he does all of our future vision for, shifting left to instead of just us staying on this right-hand side of the vulnerability management lifecycle. And I'm really excited about Bob, coming in and sharing with you our vision and what we're doing to shift left. The Director Easterly, personally brought him in because of his experience, various incident responses and major roles that he's had on the industry side. So just super, super grateful to have him on our team. And then we've got Lindsey Cerkovnik, as she runs our CVD program. So she's the queen of CVD. And she's going to talk to you about everything we do operationally and how we work really hard to keep, everyone aware of what's happening. The KEV program falls under her. And I know there's been a lot of discussions about the KEV recently. So she'll cover all of that. And then we've got Patrick Garrity. So I think you all may have seen him on LinkedIn. He puts a lot of really neat analysis together. Really appreciate all of his visualizations, and it's really important for us to be able to communicate things to every single stakeholder that we have in in the world, really, to work together in this community. And things that Patrick put together really get to the so what very quickly. And so we're very much appreciative of the partnership that he brings to the work here. So thank you guys so much for having us. So if we could go to the next slide, the first thing I wanted to do is just start out with, how are we designed in vulnerability management and kind of like the components and why we're designed this way. So I have 25 years of experience in DoD. The last year and 3 months I have been at CISA. So it's a very different culture. It's a different stakeholder base. It's a different focus. 25 years of like saluting military orders, directives, make it happen, very compliance based. That is not what CISA does. We collaborate, we build frameworks that work for everyone. And as you all know, as part of the CVE community, many CNAs in the room here, many industry partners here, a lot of what our focus has been just generally in this community has been identifying the CVE and then responding to the CVE and then working the incident response and then that entire life cycle. And then it seems like it never ends, right? It's going back to the last several years since COVID, it has extremely increased the amount of vulnerability-based attacks. So this has driven us to be very operationally focused and still reactionary in this community. And so as you can see the components there on the left, the ones I'm going to talk about first are the vulnerability response operations. So the vulnerability response operations, we're going to have this in kind of like a couple sections. We're going to talk about operations, and Lindsey's going to cover that. And then we're going to talk about how we're shifting left. The security at scale team did not exist prior to me. There was a very small number of heroes, I would call them, that were doing God's work to try to bring secure by design practice to policy.
You missed the opportunity to say the Lord's work.
The Lord's work, sorry, the Lord's work.
She's been making these jokes all week, so I just figured, like,
yeah,
you got to make it now.
Sorry, I was getting too passionate and serious. So that team did not exist. So we built it basically this last year. And then the cyber resilience team, it really didn't exist either. We stood that up to get after the maturity of organizations, so overall cybersecurity maturity. And the attack surface management capability, their evaluation capability existed in some pieces and parts, but none of our services scaled, especially not to America, right? And so what we're doing right now, as you can see, like we've taken all of our strategic, documents and policies, and we've outlined the core mission essential things that we have to actually accomplish. And it's not to just understand vulnerabilities and respond. It is to actually reduce the risk to the nation. And so we have to have a balanced approach and invest on shifting to that left-hand side more and more so that we can bring down the overall number of vulnerabilities and bring up the overall resilience of our critical infrastructure. And we have this kind of like little joke that we, if we go to the next chart, critical infrastructure is like everyone in America. I mean, it's hundreds of thousands of entities. So if you could think about how we have to, the challenges we have with data, with the diversity of the ecosystems, with the diversity of the maturity levels. This is why, our frameworks and the things that we put out are the way that they are, because we have to be the authoritative source. I heard a lot of things about, the KEV, accuracy, different models, things like that. We stand by our KEV, right? Because we have 100% accuracy in validating what's on there, because we are the authoritative source that does that. Because we have a responsibility to provide this trust to the U.S., to the American people, and the critical infrastructure providers, right? So it matters to us that we take this balanced approach and also work with you all in this community to partner, because we're seeing that you're solving these problems and we need to channel it into the outcomes that will help us as a nation. So I just wanted to put that, kind of baseline level setting of, how we're organized and what we're focused on, our why. A little joke, it's not really a joke, but it's a little phrase we say all the time when people ask us questions. We say, because China. Why? Because China. Volt Typhoon, take a look at our recent testimonies, take a look at all of our analysis on living on the land, take a look at all the recent reporting that we've done, our CSAs, because China, because critical infrastructure. That is why. So it's really important to us to be here with you, to get your feedback, to be as transparent as possible, and to work together as a collaborative team. So now we're going to kick it off to the panel. So thank you for letting me have that little bit of time to explain ourselves. Go to the next chart. All right, I'm going to give it over to Pat Garrity, because I loved this analysis. I really wanted him to give us his take on the CVE progression over time.
Yeah, I think it was said earlier, the CVE program, and relatively speaking, more recently, I've been doing a lot of research on CVEs over the last year or two. And I want to create something, that really highlighted and showed the success of the CVE program, and participation from, all the different CNAs, product companies, researchers. And so really, what you see here, I don't know if we can rewind, but it's a time progression from 2010, and of course CNAs were backdated as far as the NVD, but in 2016 you'll see the CNA program coming online, and you see more and more companies participating, issuing more CVEs and continued growth. And then suddenly, in 2023, we start seeing a lot of outliers. In 2024, you'll probably see the Linux kernel for this upcoming year up there too. But reality is most of that left is open source technology, so it's a good reflection of more and more information regarding vulnerabilities getting to people that are using the information, which I think, one thing to highlight is everyone here, a lot of product security companies, a lot of CNAs and product companies, the downstream providers, which is where I've worked most of my life, is consuming this information and trying to act on it the best that we can. So I think, highlighting everyone here, first off, like look around, it's like amazing job from a coordination perspective with the CVE program. I think I had a few other things. If you do look, about the number of CNAs, how quickly they're ramping, like we're gonna continue to see exponential growth. There's no doubt about that. I will highlight like automation of capabilities is really important. I think to some extent it's going to be hard to rely on people as these CNAs continue to scale, more and more product companies come online and the number of vulnerabilities. That means we also need to automate downstream processes. So if you talk to any of the people here that are on the VM side, or building VM products, how we consume this stuff in ways that are machine readable. So the new updates with like JSON 5 format, really important stuff. But I do want to highlight too, as I'm doing research and others look at it and consume the data, there's a lot of inconsistencies. I think it's cool. I need to go over the CVE program rules more, but there's a lot of inconsistencies on who submits what information and how thorough it is. So I did want to highlight, tell the CNAs too, some of the things we can, as consumers of this data, really use is better data entry. Sometimes that means more fields and things like CPE, CWE, CVSS, product inputs, vendor inputs. The quality of that information downstream really helps us references as far as the people that consume it, which is pretty much every security practitioner. Sorry, I'm an emotional guy. Always have to have one of those in here. So I think that's, that kind of highlights hopefully the chart and some of my feedback. And I just want to highlight, it's like everyone here participating. It's an amazing community and great job. And I like to draw pictures, and it's cool to be able to like give back a bit as far as like, showcasing all of your work, because certainly I haven't been involved in participating in like the on-ramp and contributions up until now. But if you look back, really, really amazing feat as far as the program's success.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. Do you want to say something, Lindsey?
Yeah, so one of the things I really appreciate, Patrick, about you and several others who are putting out these images and visualizations is that it kind of represents like the democratization of this vulnerability data visualization process. And I think as a CNA, CISA is a CNA, we assign CVEs and we have for a long time. It really forces me to think about what we're doing well and what we could improve. It forces me to get out of my immediate response mindset and get into a mindset of how do I make the ecosystem better. Like, 8 years ago, 6 years ago, it was really important that we provided any data. Now it's really important that we provide good data. And how do we do that? And so I really appreciate the variety of sort of visualizations that have started popping up in the last few months. It's very helpful. It's a very helpful mindset, kind of mindset altering tool for people like me. So thank you.
There was one other thing, like I just want to highlight. I think a lot of times like the exponential growth charts, and I'm guilty of creating those all the time. But that was one of the things I was just trying to solve for, is like, where is this growth actually coming from, and should we expect it more? And it's pretty evident from the trends that you see in the velocity of the CNAs adding in the number. Like it's going to continue. It's not going to stop, and that's reflective, I think, of the purpose of the program.
And I do want to say, like, we work with our partners on in the CVE program to recruit CNAs, and we're always recruiting. We are always recruiting. I think we have 300 and 65,
CNA program has over 300, close to 400.
yeah, and 65 countries or something like that. I mean, it's just grown exponentially. And, I think, I don't know if MITRE put on a CNA analysis talk to, while we were here this week, but it's really helpful that we have this, governed community ecosystem contributing to let everyone in the world know about when a vulnerability is out there. But like, as Lindsey said, like if the data is not quality, and we can't trace it back to eventually, like what we want to get to, not eventually, but hopefully like sooner versus later is the weaknesses, instead of just being on this response side of the life cycle. We need to get a lot of these, the naming issues, the schema issues, and the data quality issues really worked out across our federated ecosystem.
Yeah, and I guess when I start, do you want to go to the next
Yeah, you
slide
go
or
to the
let's go to the next slide? So I think one thing that's really important, I don't know if there's an animation.
Yeah.
Okay. I think one thing that's really important to understand is we can build this timeline out of what a vulnerability response looks like. And for people like me, and I'll go into my background a little bit and explain why I feel this way and why my perspective is what it is. For people like me, I look at this timeline and I go, it's never going to be like that. It's never going to be exactly like that, right? It's so good to put it down on paper, and then it's really good to step back and realize it's going to happen differently in every single case. And so I think we have a few sort of guiding principles, and I hate to jump around, but one of the things that Sandy said is that as part of our coordinated vulnerability disclosure process, we recruit CNAs. We absolutely do. Now, that could happen in the very beginning, or it could happen 3 years into a relationship with a vendor. But either way, one of our guiding principles is if you're working with a vendor through a CVD process and they're not a CNA and they begin to show indicators of being ready to join that program, then absolutely we should try to recruit them in and kind of frankly train them and teach them how to do it and how to be good stewards of the program. So I think this timeline is really illustrative. That's a great word. Illustrative of all the work that goes into a vulnerability response. But keep in mind, like if you've done this before, you kind of know that this timeline bounces around all the time. And it could be that you learn about a vulnerability from a vendor before it's ever exploited in the wild, and you're able to work with the vendor to disclose it properly. And you have this long lead time, and before anybody in the public knows about it, like all your boxes are checked, right? Kind of an ideal situation, kind of what people think about when they think about coordinated vulnerability disclosure. That's the typical easy peasy case, right? But does it really happen that way most of the time? Not really. So you also have cases where a security researcher discovers a vulnerability and reports it and never gets a response, and then comes to CISA as a third-party coordinator. And then we kick off our response effort. But I think the really tricky situations are when something is exploited in the wild before it's really disclosed, before the details are really known. Many people refer to these as zero-day vulnerabilities, but either way, what that means is that before any preparation has happened in a response capacity, before anybody's talked about what the root cause is, before anybody's talked about patching or fixes or mitigation, someone in the wild is exploiting this vulnerability to cause some harm of some kind. And so we're also responding to those types of situations, and actually fairly regularly. And that really mixes up what order we have to do things in. So like I said before, I've done all of these things at various times over the last almost 10 years.
Can you give them a recent use case of a vuln that bounced around, and how many times we went through the vuln identification, CVE issuing?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that many of you have seen our eVonti alert in the past month. I don't know exactly when we released it, but that case in particular is very representative of a case that we maybe understand that there's exploitation in the wild. It might take a little while to really do some root cause analysis and understand what the vulnerability or vulnerabilities are. And then we go through a CVE assignment process. And it's, if you've done CVE assignment, you understand that there are lots of CVE numbering authorities involved, and maybe one of them has, accurate scope over it, maybe one of them doesn't. We do that whole CVD process while simultaneously doing our own analysis of the vulnerability and getting information from our threat hunt teams that kind of indicates, hey, the exploitation's going, one way or another. And we're trying to figure out throughout that whole process, when do we have enough information to add this vulnerability to the known exploited vulnerabilities catalog, to the CAV catalog? When do we have enough information to put out a public alert? And a lot of coordination goes into working with the vendor to ensure that the information we put out is accurate, and working with our partners across USG to make sure that the information that we put out is not only accurate, but helpful.
Yeah, and in this case, we actually tested the mitigations and, did our own, if you notice, there's a bullet there that says Rapid Action Force. We have a team that, basically, can develop POCs, can, do exploitation testing, because we want to make sure, again, like what we're providing, this is why the accuracy thing is so important to us, we can trust what we're saying to our partners and our stakeholders that are, basically being attacked and at risk. In some cases, it's critical infrastructure. In some cases, it's federal agencies, or, we may even be working with like the Department of Defense or others. So, we take that responsibility very seriously, and it's a process. And, again, I want to go back to, this is what it takes to run CISA's vulnerability management team for America. And we can't just keep the expectation to the industry should not be that this is acceptable, that this scenario is acceptable. We have to shift it left. And the way we have to shift it left is the partners here that are the demand signal in the market space for vulnerability management, and the products, the P-Cert folks, the industry folks that are contributing. You are all the partners that can contribute towards helping to solve this problem earlier, so that we aren't in this situation as a country.
And I'd like to go back really quickly to the point I was making before, which is many of you have probably shifted around in your careers within vulnerability management. You've probably done, vulnerability research. You've probably done coordinated vulnerability disclosure. You may be a consumer of vulnerability information, but many of us have touched different aspects of this process. Many of us have touched different aspects of this process. And so to feed nicely into what I think Bob is going to cover for you shortly, if you have that fulsome understanding of where the data is created, you also understand the shortcomings of the data. So when you see and consume something like Patrick's visualizations, you understand where a point can be made and where a different point might need to be made, right? And so the onus in many ways is on all of us who do response day in and day out and don't always have the time to think about how to get left of boom, to provide that perspective so that the data we use, consume, and create can be more useful to move left of boom.
If you don't mind a question, because we were going to wait till later and then we realized maybe we need to have the conversation now. I think we have a conversation that needs to happen, because and some of it's a little tonal, some of it's understanding what you mean as to what we experience and how we interact. And I think this is really the purpose for us being here. Okay. So as you look at the slides, as software manufacturer introduces a security defect, quite honestly, introduces a different way of saying, hey, you put it in purposely, is what some people would interpret it. And I know that's not your intent. But how we go through that process and how we work the remediation, and then how that works with firmware and hardware are interrelated, slightly different. And how we work that. And the question.
We're going to talk about it in the next slide.
Okay.
We're going to explain it. Why it's labeled like that. Bob has an entire analysis on this. So
okay, because
promise.
The CVD conversation yesterday was
yeah,
totally different.
We're not blaming and shaming here. What we're saying is that there are preventable vulnerabilities, that classes of vulnerabilities, and Bob's going to talk about it. There are a lot of preventable cases. And in this case, we were talking about Ivanti, which was our example use case that.
No, that would made more sense. Okay.
Yeah. So
because it was too generic in the statement, and it's like you have us scratching our heads like, did we miss something?
No, we'll go into the why
Okay.
here in a second.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, so as we look to transition the discussion, Patrick introduced and talked about the rapid growth of CVEs and all the CNAs that are contributing to that. Lindsey's kind of laid out this life cycle of the introduction of a software defect, which becomes a vulnerability and gets a patch and can be exploited in the interim time. And we know organizations are struggling with patching this mountain of vulnerabilities, hundreds of thousands or millions of backlog vulnerabilities that have been reported. And organizations have resource constraints, both in time and investment and resources to mitigate vulnerabilities. And there's been a lot of discussion, from CISA and others. We've seen the National Cybersecurity Strategy talking about shifting that onus to the software manufacturer or supplier, for example, rather than the downstream consumer or customer as it operates now and has historically in this paradigm. And now CISA, of course, there's been public commentary from Jen Easterly and others about shifting to secure by design, secure by default, and kind of changing that narrative. And I know CISA has been championing that approach. So Bob's going to touch on that now.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So I originally started playing around with this particular sort of generic timeline, even though this doesn't really. No, I got it. We're good. We're cool. We're cool. Because I wanted to understand more about what people meant by like 0 day. So Lindsey was teasing me earlier when she said the word 0 day, she's trying to trigger me. So
It was absolutely. So can I say something too?
Please.
This phrasing, Pete, I don't want to gloss over it. This is hard for me. This is mind altering for me. Bob and I go at it every single day. No joke.
It's
It's
your
my
story.
favorite. It's my favorite thing, but it's difficult for me too. So I hear him out. Let's hear him out.
Yeah. So as somebody who's both built products for consumers and for enterprises, and then somebody who switched gears to be a defender, trying to make sure that we could keep things secure. I was the CISO for a Fortune 500 company, and spoiler alert, this won't surprise anybody in this room. We couldn't patch all the things for one set of reasons, not technically possible, close to laws of physics. Then I was the CISO for a 200-person not-for-profit. And would anybody be surprised to learn that we couldn't patch all the things for a different set of reasons, some overlapping, but different. So the question is, when we start taking a look at these generic timelines and we start focusing on things like those terrible times when the defenders are unable to remediate, something's being exploited in the wild, and there's little I can do other than to turn it off, or maybe you can turn a feature off. But that's a very serious problem. And I felt that many times. And so the question here, and so I think that there's one last build, if I did this right, it'll be on the next one. So as we think about this particular world, what we want to do is think a little bit about that last line there. How do we drive that feedback loop? How do we start learning from these remediations collectively, defenders of organizations, but more importantly, the product companies? How can we start to learn about the patterns? And it's an open question. I don't have the complete answer, but I think a good part of this is thinking about classes of vulnerability and thinking about ways that we can learn from people who have been out there teaching about these things for quite some time. Yes. Oh, you want to ask a follow-up question? Okay. But you may, if you like.
Well, no, I was going to say, give a couple examples of classes of vulnerability so the folks.
Well,
If I had a nickel for every time we said memory safety.
yeah, so right. So that's exactly right. So I think this is the generic thing that I want to figure out how to talk a lot more about. So you're going to hear us say the phrase classes of vulnerability, classes of defect over and over and over again, because we got to get out of the world where we're playing whack-a-mole. And it turns out that we're pretty good at playing whack-a-mole, but that's a losing game. And so part of the reason why we talk about introduces is, and there are probably other words that would suffice, but these are not acts of nature. These are not things that come out of the blue. These are not unpredictable, unknowable kinds of problems. In fact, these things are often so common that we have names for them. They show up on top 10 lists. And there are organizations that have sprung up to teach us how to not do those things, to avoid those things. So I want to put words into the active voice, not the passive voice. And when we do that, we start to have a different conversation. And so when we talk about shifting left, part of that is to move things into the active voice. Maybe introduces is not the best word, but I want an active verb in there. I want an actor who's doing a thing. Somebody could have or should have done more. And one of the things that I ran into recently, again, is the 2007 Unforgivable Vulnerabilities paper. How many people know that? Oh no, you're supposed to all raise your hands.
Todd,
Cheater.
he's part of our
He's
team.
seen the slides. So I saw this, I don't know when I saw this, 10 years ago. I confess, I didn't get it. Like, sometimes you're just not ready. You might read something and you're just not ready to absorb it, to connect it to other things. And I'm just here to admit, there are many times in my career, I just wasn't ready to hear the wisdom. So I stumbled upon this a few months ago. And so this is a list. It's a great paper, and it's
Miter wrote this paper.
Miter wrote this
Thank you,
paper.
Miter.
Yes, and so it's just a very good paper. It's a very thoughtful paper. It's not just this list. It comes up with a methodology, and so what would constitute an unforgivable vulnerability? And so they came up with this list. And if you can read this, which maybe you can't, but I'll bet you're going to see some phrases in that you recognize. And in fact, it might be the case that if you take a look at another great MITRE publication, The Stubborn Weaknesses, you might start to see some patterns. And you might start to see that memory safety keeps popping up over and over again. And you might find that a whole bunch of other classes of vulnerability are still around 17 years later. And some others, maybe the connection is a little bit weaker, but there are still some connections there. And over in the side there, I put like a check mark next to grow your own crypto, but then I saw a presentation the other day that said, maybe I don't really need to give it full credit. Maybe we still have some problems there. So I have to go back and do some research. And a couple others, I have question marks because I'm wondering to what degree have we actually solved this problem, or do we just call it something different today? So that's what I'd love to do, is some more analysis. So back to, when Patrick does his analysis, he's curious about the data and he's exploring the data in lots of different ways. And we need more of that. And so when you take a look at the history of other industries, which I recommend that you spend more time thinking about other industries than about the world of software, you see things like the automotive industry. If you go look for the ratio of deaths per billion miles driven in the US, there's a great Wikipedia article on this, you'll see that they have data that goes back to 1920. And so they have the same visualization every year. Every few years, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, whatever, they add a few more pixels on the right. Same graph, same metrics, they just have a few more years of data. We need more of that. So all of you who are doing visualizations and data analysis to figure out what we're doing, this is evidence that we're starting to mature as an industry. The software industry is starting to get better, and we're starting to learn. So all of you who spent the last 25 years building an infrastructure that allows us to do this, thank you for that.
Yeah, and the industry is getting better. I mean, do you want to talk about a couple of examples of transitions to, programming language, more secure programming languages, or partners that we've worked with that have made commitments and pledges?
I mean, the funny thing is so these are the recurring themes that we see. What we don't actually see here are the companies that have made the investments to eliminate classes of vulnerability. So I pick on XSS because I helped lead the transformation to eliminate cross-site scripting at Twitter in 2010, 2011. Engineering team did a great job. They did a great job because I remember in September of 2010, we had, I think it was over 20 externally reported valid cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, which means on any given day, we're receiving a new valid report. We're trying to QA the code that was fixed yesterday from that report, and we're trying to deploy the code that came in the day before that. That was a nightmarish situation, and the engineering team worked very hard. And if you go back and look for like, when was CSP invented? When did the browser start supporting that? You're going to say like, boy, that must have been kind of crazy and rough. And yes, it was. We have better tools than we did back then. So that's one of the reasons why we pick on that. But like, take a look at your favorite web properties. When was the last time they had a cross-site scripting vulnerability? And the answer in many cases is not for at least a decade, or if it was such an edge case that, you know, it's worthy of some note. So I think we have been making progress in a number of different areas, but you've heard the expression, the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. That's what we have here. And so we need to figure out a way to democratize all of this, make it easier for organizations to eliminate these. But again, what I'd love to see is, I don't want to wait another 17 years. I would hope that over the next few years, we can use these visualization techniques and more people can do data mining to figure out, how do we make sure that in 3 years, we have a different set of classes of vulnerability up here. That for me is going to be success.
So I want to ask a follow-on question. Obviously, we've heard terms like software liability. I'm not trying to take us in the legal direction, but we know as practitioners, a big part of this is organizations may not be incentivized to go take these measures and implement these mitigations and make these investments. What's your perspective on the ability of transparency to the consumer to help empower them to make more risk-informed decisions in consumption and purchases to drive producers to make these changes?
Yeah, so this is a really important point. So also in 2007, there was a lot of interesting stuff. iPhone came out. There was a book published by a guy named David Rice, and it's called Geekonomics. And if you want to understand the economic and incentives that underpin the software industry, it's a really good book. It's sort of good news, bad news is it was 2007, so it's going to be stale. On the other hand, we still have some work to do, so it'll be surprisingly fresh. His footnotes will be very strange and dated, but a lot of the underlying issues still exist. So I think the kinds of work that this community has built are going to be instrumental in 2 different ways. One is, my experience has been, when you create a good, you mentioned transparency within an organization, engineers and product people, they all want to do the right thing. But if they don't know what good looks like, it's hard for them to do that. And so like, back to the, cross-site scripting and other things back in 2010, which is a million internet years ago. We built internal dashboards that showed prevalence of certain classes of vulnerability and assigned those to various teams. And what we found is there's kind of 3 buckets. One bucket of teams would chip away at these defects every sprint. So every 2 weeks, we'd see a couple knocked down, a couple more knocked down, so not fast, but trending in the right direction. Other groups would spend entire sprints doing nothing but kill the vulnerabilities. And so we'd see their graphs go chunk, chunk, chunk. The third group was the ones who just stayed flat, and those were the ones that we needed to escalate to management. But that was a small percentage. Like, my personal experience is that when you provide information in the way that people can digest it, they end up largely doing the right thing. That's within the companies. Your point is also, it takes 2 to tango. And so we're going to have to think about ways in which we start prioritizing our purchasing decisions based on the ability for companies to eliminate certain classes of vulnerability. Like, it's 2024, there are SQL injection vulnerabilities in edge networking equipment. Like that, it was unforgivable in 2007. Let me tell you, it's causing us a national security problem today. And we should be increasingly intolerant of that sort of thing. And we should find ways to support the people who are building those tools. And so, I think there are tools available, but awareness is going to be a major component of that. We got to start there.
You mentioned the ability to escalate to management. Should vulnerability burn down, for example, not be prioritized by product teams? And this has been mentioned in the Secure by Design. Need for executive buy-in and management involvement. How can product teams and companies and so on drive that buy-in from executive leadership to make these security investments?
I mean, I can talk about a little bit from the perspective of the product security teams who are doing the actual coordinated vulnerability disclosure and fixing of the vulnerabilities, and then in many cases preparing, messaging that would go out to customers. they are seeing trends too. It's not like CISA standing on the podium going, there's a trend, there are path traversals everywhere. Like these product security teams are the boots on the ground that actually they identify the trend, and in many cases are the ones who are messaging that up. I don't know if anybody saw the root cause mapping panel discussion earlier this week, but Dina from NVIDIA made a really good point that her team is assigning CWEs and then making sort of they are able to take the statistics from the assignment of those CWEs to make sort of broader, I think, to do some broader analysis about their products and to fix them. And I think that that's really an easy thing to take to your leadership and say, hey, if we were to take these 3 specific actions on our teams, or do this type of training or focus for 3 months, this type of sprint, we might eliminate, statistically this many vulnerabilities, which would in that case, buy down this many hours of labor. So I think there are ways that you can do it from, my perspective is sort of that boots on the ground, like this is how I'm actually responding to the vulnerability. I think there are ways to do it from the bottom up, but I also I believe a lot of it starts at the top.
No.
This kind of builds on a moment later on the exploitation side. I do a lot of research on exploitation, the KEV, and one of the common themes is just initial access vulnerabilities. So things that are internet facing, firewalls, remote access, FTP, mail servers, web servers. I'm sure some of you work on those. Yes. All right. But no, it's all good. I think generally like there's an observation and it's like, oh yeah, are you going to go and rewrite all those products from the ground up in a new coding language? Anybody doing that right now? Probably not. So I think, on the secure design stuff, from my perspective, I had the same reaction. It's like, oh wow, we're going to build a new product. What I found interesting at this conference and talking to people, sorry, I'm always emotional when I talk. I don't know why. What's interesting is some of the organizations that I saw that are initial access products that are not pervasive on the KEV, but are in pervasive use. When I talk to them, I'm like, why don't you have as many CVEs? Why don't you, why don't you have more vulnerabilities on the KEV? Because that's like the type of questions I ask, right? Basically what I heard was, because every time we have a vulnerability, we do root cause analysis. We look around that vulnerability. We review the code base. We review the different components, packages, and all of it. And then we make a determination if we're going to rewrite that component. And typically they're doing it in something like Go. Like pretty simple, actionable. You don't have to rewrite your whole product. But I think a good aspect is when we're talking about memory safety and modern code bases, like taking those types of actions, like the data shows from a perspective of that type of action can make a pretty big difference, especially when we're talking about initial access devices. And I do think like I'm going to release some new research or a little bit different visual on the Avanti stuff. Also, for all my private equity friends out there, it's like you continue to literally pass these products across companies to companies to companies, reducing resources. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, right? But like having limited resources applying to these products to actually, modernize them and keep them secure is a really, really big challenge. And so I think just emphasizing, I know all you teams have limited resources, but definitely from a company standpoint, like the need for more resources on the product security side, on the development side, like really, really important from my perspective in helping build product security companies.
I was going to say, let's talk about how we at CISA, Lindsey, are working to get better. I mean, what are we doing to, make a difference to shift left?
Sure. I think one of the things so I like to operationalize things. I've never met a problem I didn't like. I like to solve problems. I like to take big ideas from Bob Lord, and I like to say, what are the building blocks that get us to solving this problem in a realistic way? And so one of those things is that for every coordinated vulnerability disclosure case that we do, we are collecting some of that information internally for our own team's knowledge and awareness. If, you know, it's good for us to understand the trends too. So that's like a basic step 0, right? And then we take that information and we can share back in our dialogue back and forth with some of these secure by design principles with our vendor friends that we do coordinated vulnerability disclosure with. I don't know if anyone has seen the blog post, but there's a lot of discussion about CSAF today, Common Security Advisory Framework, and VEX over the last couple of days. About 6 months ago, maybe a little bit longer, we started producing and publishing all of our vulnerability advisories in CSAF format. They're available on CISA's GitHub, in addition to the kind of normal machine or human readable format that we've always published. I don't think that CSAF is, or any machine readable advisory format is like the ultimate solution, but my job is kind of to do the building blocks. It's kind of to say like, well, if we start here, then we're 25% towards a better solution in 2 years. And so in a lot of cases, like identifying like what is our first small step that we can do right now to ensure that in 2 years, we have a lot more data that we can actually analyze that makes sense, that is relatively clean, that is relatively consistent. I think that's one thing.
Yeah, it's not just the data. Like, so we do a lot of scanning. We do a lot of like prevalence analysis of vulnerabilities. We're doing now a lot of this linkage of CVEs to CWEs and things like that. But we're starting to get more into this, and this gets after like kind of your question with the vendors. And I want to remind everyone about the stakeholder base we have as critical infrastructure. It's such a diverse problem. They're all so very different. So the way is to work with the technology vendors and manufacturers, and it's to have not just more data, but the depth of data on software quality that we need to build the criteria to ensure that the stakeholders out there and consumers have a transparent understanding of what they're buying. The criteria needs to be something that can span across all, both, including open source, all these things that we need to have awareness of. And, we're being looked at in the federal government as the leader to drive that new policy and that criteria and that guidance, right? And so that security at scale team, these heroes that Bob is bringing into the fold to help, they're the ones leading the development of these new, this depth of data that we have to understand to then be able to set the tone for everyone else. And mainly, like, if we just keep doing the working with the entity only, because we do a ton of that. We are working with, ransomware issues, doing assessments on site. It's endless. We have to raise the level of education with them, and we have to raise the level of transparency for the consumer. But that is through the partnership with the technology vendors and doing this depth of analysis that we need to on software security.
And I think, and Bob, this may be more in your wheelhouse that you want to talk about it, but to introduce it, I think it's really important to recognize, to have some self-awareness that in this room, if you're in this room, you already have a lot more knowledge than the average consumer of CISA's products, for example. Mm-hmm. And so we are not only dealing with the issue of trying to do something very niche, we are also trying to bring like the collective understanding of what our baseline expectations for product security up a lot. And I think one of the ways that we're doing that recently is with the Secure by Design alerts. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so in addition to the Secure by Design white paper, the memory safety white paper, and some of the other things, we now have a series that we started a few months ago, which are Secure by Design alerts. And these are short 2-pagers. Sometimes we get a little verbose and it hangs over to 2.5 pages. But basically, it's a 2-page document that talks about some of these classic things that have gone wrong that we see in the wild. And so we've recently released one on SQL injection. And you can assume that there'll be other things that on one of those prior slides, we may have some additional ones. And so as we see some of these other classic unforgivable vulnerabilities and other kinds of things popping up, you'll see us do just short 2-pagers on it. And I've been surprised at how many people have written in saying those are more impactful than the bigger document because they're pointed, they're opinionated, and they help us drive change. both from so you asked about the consumers as well as the product teams, both have written in saying like that's super impactful. So if you haven't seen those, please check those out, CISA.gov/secure by design. And if you scroll down a little bit past the video of me and the amazing Jack Cable doing a rapid fire version of our Black Hat talk, below that, you'll see the little link for the Secure by Design alerts.
And I think we're close to time, but I think, do we have a,
Questions or?
We have time for questions. So if anybody's got something from the audience, I'm going to start back here.
CVE record data quality means different things to different people. I'm interested in what you all feel that means to you.
You might have. Okay, I'll go first and then I'll pass it to you. How does that sound? For me, CVE record quality means, and actually I attended your talk, so I appreciate your question. We get there are a lot of, often if you're parsing the data, there are a lot of empty fields, like, right? If you get an NA in a field, it's not super useful. Product name, version number, as a CNA, I'm going to look out for my own records first and make sure that we are doing what we can. But I think do you hear feedback? Sorry. I think making sure that we're filling out, everything that we're filling out has content quality, is accurate to the best of our abilities, and that we're not leaving things blank that are pretty important for parsing out like product and version number when we know, when we have enough information to publish it. That being said, like future of CVE records, I would love to see more people putting in common weakness enumeration numbers, CWEs, accurately. I would love to see people providing fewer empty fields and fewer NAs, where that information is clearly mapped to like a pretty important tool scraping that information out, like to your point in your presentation. So, it's like the immediate problem now is make sure that we're not putting in incorrect data or putting it in incorrectly. And the longer term problem is like determine what the most important fields are and do it.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. Like the whole world uses NVD, right? All the information comes from CVE program. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about NVD. No, it's all good. But I think it's really important to emphasize, and we have this pause, which is really weird. But a lot of times the information also isn't populated that's required for it to populate in the NVD. And there's data validation aspects, and I know everyone's doing God's work for free, coordinated in this program, right? So it's not meant to be a critic, but yeah, there's empty fields in NVD where there's CWE data, or some, but not all the fields were filled out. So I think generally there's inconsistencies in data. And having spent a team in the last 2 weeks generating CPE data from CVE, in order to validate that stuff, you need like products and descriptions. And it's like, that should be baseline type of stuff that gets entered in when you're entering CVE information. So I would just say in general, not trying to be a critic, the more, garbage in, garbage out, the more the CNAs can enter and provide more information because they're closest to the product. It's likely that we're going to get better outputs on the back end in regards to information that like real practitioners can action on. That are consuming their data and products like Qualys and Tenable and the 100 other VM products out there. So that's just one of my best recommendations.
So I have a couple of thoughts. You talked on slide 5 about software manufacturers. That language is loaded. There's a lot of, and in fact, a lot of your sort of observations today clearly were expressing frustration at the state of the industry. It's 2024. Why are you guys still doing this? And the span of people producing software, from open source to collectives to individuals, is much more nuanced than when you talk about software manufacturers. And that language is dangerous. And we've seen that in Europe with the CRA and just a complete cluster of complexity that came out of that conversation. So I would really ask you to think about that language and be more nuanced.
So we thought long and hard about that. So the reason that we want to have this language is that we want to start talking about active entities performing actions. And so one of the reasons I don't like the word vendor is that a reseller of software products is a vendor. A company that is an MSSP or an MSP is a vendor. We want to talk about the people who make software. And so maybe publisher is a different word. And so there are some things like that. But what we want to do is start to use words that pinpoint where it is that we can have the most leverage. And to date, what we have is a world in which we've shifted the burden onto the customers to stand up huge teams, and I've had to do this myself. And so we want to have that conversation. So I hear you. But we want to have this conversation. The fact that we're talking about this right now is part of the maturation. This is what other industries have gone through. So I love your question.
Okay. So building on that, I also heard a lot of frustration as well in terms of like prioritization of this work versus other things that are happening and private equity companies taking old software that people still want to use and not investing in security on it. That's an economics problem. And you can bitch and moan till the cows come home. It's not going to change because the market decides to make it change. And it's certainly not going to change because consumers suddenly become incredibly savvy about E. coli in meat or memory vulnerabilities in their software. Regulation is the only way out of this. And that's it. I mean,
I just want to make a quick comment. I think his point is incredibly accurate, and like something we can't gloss over is that, I published a piece called Supplier Misnomer, and it talks about the fact that open source software maintainers and contributors are not suppliers in the traditional sense. There's no contractual relationship. There's no SLA. We shouldn't be making demands of them per se, because often they're doing this at their own free will. We're taking advantage of it, and we should be assuming responsibility of it if we're integrating those components into our products and selling them to someone else downstream. So I think that point can't be glossed over. And then also, I agree with the regulatory piece, but we got to be careful what we wish for.
And we recognize this is what we're working on. So, it's a change, it's a shift, and we have to understand this problem a lot more and to be able to drive. We don't want the regulatory end state to drive the outcome we're not seeking to get to, right? So we want to partner with industry to get to this level of transparency and communicate more effectively and understand what the criteria are so that we are assuring the outcome is what we want to get to, right? And the frustration isn't, it's not like, we hate this company or whatever. It's just that, we're trying to defend America here, and this is also an American company. So it's a little bit of an uncomfortable position. We want to do the right thing for the country. We're trying to understand this problem collaboratively. We're trying to keep people safe. It's in some cases an emergency situation, type of thing. So, but yeah, help us. I mean, this is part of the reason for the questions here at the end. This is a community. Everything we do here in this VulnCon, this is why I really wanted to come to this conference, is everything's run as a community. I love how the Secure by Design team and the OSS team, the open source security team, did RFIs recently. We got a lot of RFIs from industry. I want to see us do that more in this side of the community, to hear what your recommendations are so that the change can be a community-driven change. Because it's like you said, it's a market, right? We have to demand, the demand signal has to demand this to be a capability or to be an expectation or to be a requirement. And, regulation will help with that as well, right? Hopefully that's our goal. But, we as a country, like we develop things because there's a need, there's a demand. And we need to, as a community, put this demand signal out. And I think it will drive a lot of change. We're already making a lot of change. I mean, this is a significant amount of change that we've collectively developed over the last, 15 years. Does anybody else have anything? Do we have more time for questions?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Last one. Sorry. First of all, thank you for a great panel discussion. I have a feeling that we made a small mistake, or not mistake, sorry, some vocabulary mismatch. In one of the slides, there was 2007 unforgivable vulnerabilities, when on the table, there was a list of weaknesses. So it's something that we should be very careful and make sure that we, as a PSER, to use it, right terms, and everyone,
Are you talking about the CWEs that were listed?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, right. So what's the?
Saying like,
Can you just clarify this?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that was the title of the paper.
What's the paper?
That was the title of the paper.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, so you can go look for that. It'll pop up. It'll be like the number one hit if you type, MITRE 2000 and so MITRE unforgivable vulnerabilities. You'll find the paper.
And this was going to be one of my questions to you, Bob, and it kind of goes to what he's saying here is like there's a lot of talk about, eliminating unforgivable vulnerabilities and, kind of forcing more responsibility from suppliers. But I also don't think CISA is advocating for infallible software that's perfect and completely free of defects. It's
Yeah,
more
that's right.
a reasonable level of
How do we
rigor.
keep getting better? I think that's the question. And there's certain classes of vulnerability for which mitigations have been known not just for years, but for decades. And we need to find, first of all, we need to find those heroes who've actually eliminated those classes of vulnerability. We need to ask them to speak up. Google did a paper 3 weeks ago, something like that. So if you go, I don't actually know if you can Google this, but like Google Secure by Design, I don't actually know if
I
that'll.
think it was written by Christopher Kern.
Yeah, so Christoph Kern. And so that'll actually get you the right hit. So they've done it. Other companies have done a little bit of this, but we need people who have done the work to eliminate certain classes of vulnerability and make that part of the routine. We need them to talk more about it. I mean, sometimes they whisper to me and that's great, but we need them to blog about it, talk at conferences so that we can celebrate their wins and so that we all know what good looks like. And existence proof is a powerful motivator to help you go back to your management team and say, they've done it. Let's figure out how we can do it too.
All right, we're going to squeeze one last question in here.
So I came out here to, so I work for one of the VM vendors that Patrick mentioned, and I'm in a privileged position to work with some of our nation's largest organizations within their sectors. And the problem of how do we get actual risk reduction is part of why I came out here this week to understand how to help these organizations operationalize their risk reduction. And what I'm finding, what I'm hearing from the people on the ground is that it's not that we need more prioritization tools. It's that we need more mature prioritization tools in front of us. So EPSS is a great tool, but then we also have CAV, we have CVSS, and my own company developed their own, and then other vendors have their own. And it just goes on and on and on. We add more letters to the equation. Nothing actually gets done because we're all now using all these tools. And so what I'm finding is that these people are chasing their tails, and the larger the organization gets, the harder the problem becomes. It's a mo money, mo problems thing, actually. And so what are you guys, and Lindsey, I talked to you about this a bit yesterday. How do we start operationalizing in a more consistent way from sector to sector to sector? I don't work with just one industry. I work with many, and they are all doing things very differently from each other. And so where are we seeing successes in things like telecom, which would be critical infrastructure at this point, or energy, or what have you? Because there's a lot of tools. It's very overwhelming, and the engineers are very overwhelmed right now.
Just real quick, if I could, I don't, I'll let Lindsey speak here, but in my experience of working in different highly regulated environments, it's often driven by policy and requirements that are going to tell you to use certain prioritization schemes and approaches and SLAs around, vulnerability severities and so on. So it has to be driven from that direction, in my opinion, to get some kind of standardized approach.
No, I think that's a really fair comment. And besides that, if you were to sort of take a neutral approach to it and an organization or sector neutral approach to it, I think CISA is a really big proponent of using decision trees for your prioritization. It's very simple. I know I talked about democratizing vulnerability data visualization. Let me talk about democratizing prioritization, because a decision tree is, to me, the best way to do that. We use SSVC. There was a talk about it earlier. We operationalized SSVC a few years ago, and we use it across CISA to do vulnerability prioritization and response. For us, it's been very successful. That stakeholder-specific mindset is very useful for kind of outlining how we would make decisions and what actions are associated with each of those decision outcomes. It makes it defensible to your leadership, and it makes it something that you can communicate to all levels of your organization. I think it's a great tool. And I think that's something that could be, taking into consideration your comment about regulation, which I think is very fair, sort of sector neutral for an internally for your own organization.
Wow, this was stimulating because I see a lot of people paying attention. So First objective achieved. Second objective was at the conference, let's really go into hard questions. And I think you opened that door. The question is how we take this. So I want us to remember, and to closing, this is one of those things where we want to talk about what do we do for the future. Okay, because this is a lively, and I can tell you, we were all exercised to some degree in different ways, which is good. That's why we're here. So thank you very much, panel, for bringing that forward and getting us motivated, and for the morning session on the third day, waking us up. Well done. Thank you.